there you go, recording in progress. That way others can watch later on. But Tenakoto, Tenatatua, Kaptua. So I just want to welcome everybody. And as I said, we'll be recording this so others can watch later, and which will be nice for them to see. Working WCA across so many different time zones is really kind of tricky. So we've had a lot of folks who are coming in bright and early, others coming in late at night. So it's kind of like balancing things out. So it's the last session of the day today, and then we have more sessions tomorrow. So please do check out the schedule. And if you are not a member of WCA, I would please encourage you to join if you are not. So please do consider that. So what we are doing during this session is talking about, prejudice and COVID-19 in Latin America. I think we could call it Latin, South America, and kind of that larger area. Latin America itself, I don't know if the term, I'll let Tony talk more about that term probably later. He's better at that area than I am. But the term itself is kind of just, I don't know, perplexes me a little bit from a geopolitical point of view. But anyway, it's part of a larger research project that's been going on here from Massey University, bringing in researchers and collaborators from, I think now we have just about 20 plus countries. And one of the things that I will share is, I have it right. Do I have it or do I not have it? The joys of technology, particularly when you are used to working on 3 different screens, and now you have one little laptop to work on. And so let me just share my screen so I can show you basically a little bit of kind of what we're. So can you see this picture here? So what we have there is basically all of the yellow countries are where in this larger research project we've already collected data in. The blue ones are ones that are in progress. And the red, well, that was the default in the map is red. And this one gray is still, it's disputed. So that's why it turns up as gray. It's just disputed between Morocco and Western Sahara. So it's a disputed country. But it's been really interesting, as I'll frame this and then I'll turn things over to Tao and Tony and them, is to really look at this region and to explore COVID. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about today, is kind of what that has meant for us. So what I'll do now is I will turn things, I think there's a PowerPoint. If you want to go ahead, you can just screen share from there and then let that guide the conversation. I think Tony's jumping in first on things, and I'll let Tony introduce himself. For those of you who don't know me, I think I've seen most people, but I'm Stephen Croucher. I'm actually the president of WCA, based in Wellington, New Zealand. So it's now 1 p.m. here on Friday. I had to check the date myself. So 1:08 on Friday. So over to you, Tao, if you want to just, it's kind of just a guide for kind of where we're going in this conversation.
So Stephen, can you
so you'll be able to just go to the bottom and just click share screen. Should just let you.
I want to be wherever Tao is on her desktop, on her background. That's really pretty.
Well, I've just made you also, Tao, a co-host, so you should have it. So you should be able to.
Yeah, because I really miss Europe right now, so the background is Greece. Yeah.
Yeah, I can tell it's beautiful.
There we go.
All right.
So as we see, we have the COVID-19 in Latin America, and going from there is to our next slide. Our next main point is I will turn things over now to Dr. Anthony Spencer.
Hello, everybody, and thanks for inviting me to participate in this presentation as well as the project. Stephen and Tal, I really appreciate it. Kind of most of my area of expertise is Latin America, and I think Stephen hit up a great point, like what is Latin America, right? What do we call this region of the world? It's not always so easy as we would think. When I teach Latin American studies specific courses, most of the texts say everything that speaks Spanish or Portuguese except Puerto Rico because it's part of the US, right? And of course, except the Southwest US because it's part of the US, even though you have Spanish speakers there. Some texts will say Haiti is part of Latin America, but most leave out the US Virgin Islands, other English speaking parts of the Caribbean. They leave out Belize. So we're leaving out a geographic chunk, but we're including, especially for this study, we would have a working definition of Spanish and Portuguese speaking countries. And I say Portuguese speaking countries, there's only one, but it's a big one. Brazil is a huge country. So why Latin America? The pandemic has hit Latin America particularly hard because of infrastructure, because of political ideologies right now, and the way certain regimes have been operating the last couple of decades in the region. And also there are severe impacts on ethnic and linguistic minorities. And this is something that we'll speak to, I know Stephen will speak to when we talk about Brazil and the study that we've been working on in Brazil. And that's really important as far as ethnic minorities and how they're being treated during the pandemic. And also the pandemic is leading to political movements. It's leading to political change. We see this, I mean, we see this right now in Cuba. I don't know about substantive change, but we see some change going on. We've seen the election results in Peru recently, where a far left school teacher has been elected president of the country. Can you go to the next slide for me, please, Tom?
Yeah.
And some of the particular countries with particular COVID problems across the region include Brazil, which Stephen, I know we'll talk about later, Peru, Mexico, Nicaragua. That was one that I've been working on a lot with research, and one that we don't have a lot of good data with, just because the government isn't sharing the data. So it's really hard to say these are the hardest hit countries when the government won't release the data that it has. Okay. Can I have the next slide, please, Tal? Some of the social and economic impacts that we're seeing, of course, deaths. In many countries, people are being buried at night in secret. There's a lack of infrastructure for vaccinations. There's been a loss of jobs that you and I can only imagine, because many of these governments don't have at least these supplemental programs, back to work programs. Once you lose your job, you lose everything that you have. And many people, if they don't pay into the social security system, they're not covered even by basic health insurance, because they might have what we call temporary jobs or precarious status. And we'll talk about that in a minute. And we're also seeing increased immigration within the region to more stable countries like Costa Rica, like Colombia, which had been more stable, but has recently also seen some really violent protests, and increased immigration to the US. And when I was talking about the vast majority of Latin America, almost half of Latin America is under what we call microempresas, or like micro enterprises, which are these teeny tiny businesses of 10 employees or fewer. But many work in what's called the informal economy. So if you can't go out and vend your wares on the street, you literally have no job. Like, you have no income if you can't go out and sell that day, and you're living hand to mouth. And so it's really difficult for certain people, because there are fewer economic protections than we see in other regions like North America, Australia, New Zealand. We don't see, most countries don't have these economic protections for people when the economy goes bad. And I've also hinted at, but we're talking about a recent political turmoil in the region. Cuba, in the last couple of days, we've seen these images across our television screens. Nicaragua, for the last few years, well, we could say for the last 35 years has been embroiled in heavy conflict. But the last 3 years has been involved in conflict of an uprising against the Ortega regime, which was happening as the pandemic came about. Venezuela, of course, we know about. Colombia, I've mentioned. Chile, Peru, these are all countries that either have gone left or have leftist leanings because of the inequities, because the people who are on whatever the right is were not taking care of the people, and the people have then turned their vote, turned their support. So it's really important to understand that we're conducting this COVID research in Latin America while all of this political turmoil is going on. Okay, can you go to the next slide, please? And we're also talking about uneven resources, which obviously also lead to the changes in governments, because we're talking about a lack of wealth distribution. 1 to 3 to 5% of the countries maintain all of the wealth, and the rest of the countries are really, really suffering. We're talking about sometimes abject poverty. There were emerging middle classes in many of these countries, but because of the pandemic, that's mostly been wiped out. We're also talking about issues of race and class. And sometimes the government actually works against international efforts because the government wants to keep power. Will you go to the next slide, please, Phil? The one example I'm thinking of is Nicaragua held a love in the time of COVID party because they said that COVID won't feed the people. You have to get out and sell your items. So after Love in the Time of Cholera by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, the Ortega government literally pushed people out into the streets and created a super spreader event because that was the way they were dealing with the pandemic. And Mather and all stated this has perhaps been the most erratic of any response in the world to date. And I'd like to turn it over to Stephen to talk about now that I've set up some of the background, what's going on in Latin America, so he can talk about some of the theoretical constructs. And I hope you don't mind, but I do have to go to the other presentation, so I'm so sorry. But I'm gonna slip out quietly.
I will, thank you so much. I'll actually turn things over to Tal. Tal will be talking about theoretical constructs and going through those for us all, so.
Thank you, Tal.
Okay, thank you, Anthony. So I really feel like really interested in this project because we have brought in a lot of theoretical constructs from different areas. For example, like based on the guideline of integrated threat theory, so we explored how we can predict the prejudice amid the COVID-19 pandemic. So Stefan and Stefan have developed integrated threat theory in order to apprehend, explain, and predict prejudice. So basically, there are 4 types of threats: realistic threats, symbolic threats, intergroup anxiety, and negative stereotypes. And the next theoretical construct we used in our project is the ethnocentrism, because we believe that the discriminatory attitudes and behaviors, meaning that one person can think their own group culture is more superior than the others. So this is one of the main constructs that we use in order to connect the integrated threat theory in the context of COVID-19 pandemic. And the next thing we want to talk about is the spiral of silence theory. In the willingness to voice one's opinions on an issue, depending on whether their viewpoints are in the majority or minority, is quite important in this context, as we all know that the media in the COVID-19 pandemic have brought in a lot of issues related to discrimination, prejudice around the world. So that's why we want to explore more on spiral of silence theory. Oh. So in our project, so we asked people a lot of things related to our constructs, such as like, for example, for integrated theory. So we asked them like if they have any contact with Asians or Chinese in their work or school, or how do they feel when they interact with these people. And for ethnocentrism, so we ask people if they feel like their culture is more superior than the other cultures. Spiral of silence, we used 12 items from Spencer and Croucher's test of spiral of silence in order to ask people about their opinion toward their government's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. We have adapted 14 items of Butol et al. In order to ask people about their fear of COVID-19. For example, like do they feel that they are afraid of getting the virus if they use the public toilet? So in order to connect these items, we also ask people about their health behavior, like self-advocacy, like if they keep notes about their illness or treatment, or they research their treatments for their illness, etc. So I think that's all I want to share with you. So next, shall we have some more information about the Brazil project, Stephen?
Sure. Thank you, Tao. Before we get into the Brazil project, just briefly, I mentioned earlier at the start, we've collected data thus far in Argentina, Chile, Brazil, Peru, and we're in the process of collecting data in Colombia, Costa Rica, and Nicaragua. And I always think it's nice to talk about methodological issues. And it's especially like the social, like I'm a quantitative researcher, even though I was trained as a qualitative semiotician, is what my doctoral training was in. I've gone much more into, as my advisor says, the dark side. But when you're doing this kind of research, especially cross-national, I wouldn't use cross-cultural, but cross-national comparisons, there's a lot of issues of validity and reliability that come in. So I'll briefly mention that before I get into the Brazil project. Is one of the things we have is, we have multiple scales that are developed in the US on American participants, generally white or Caucasian Christian participants who are middle class typically. Let's just break it down to what it really is. So one of the things we had to do, first of all, and not just in these countries, but throughout all of our analyses, is we first of all work with people in the field on translating the instruments. So we had to translate these instruments into Spanish and Portuguese. And not Portuguese, but Brazilian Portuguese, and not just like Spanish like in Spain, but actually like South American Spanish. And so we had to work with, quite a few people to get our translations right. And by right, I mean, we looked at things such as conceptual. So with the idea of fear, what do we mean by fear? If we're asking it in Spanish, there's different ways to say fear. There's different ways to say respect. And so we had to really nuance those things by having different translators speak to each other and actually come to a level of reliability, if you want to call it. So that was one of the first things. We also had issues of face reliability. And that was an important matter to think about, is really the issue of, does this look like it actually measures something? Thank you. And so that's another big thing. So the translation was done. We found that in general it worked, but you never know 100%. Someone could still misunderstand something. So then we did run confirmatory factor analyses, or basically we checked the validity of all the measures just to make sure that they work. What we found is that they don't perform the same way in every country. And so in the end, if we're comparing, say, 5 countries in a study, what we'll do is, if any of the items need to be removed because they just don't fit the factor structure when you respecify, we delete those items across all of the countries to get one scale that works pan-nationally. And in some cases, this didn't work. I'll just say, doing this larger study. In some cases, there were scales that just didn't work, which I'll just say for doctoral students and others out there, early career researchers, that's okay. Because you can actually argue it's a methodological contribution, is you're finding that previously developed scales don't work in this context. Also the issue of, we did the study on Qualtrics or SurveyMonkey, A lot of people didn't have access to technology. So in Nicaragua and Costa Rica, for example, we're collecting the data paper-based. Takes a lot longer to collect those that data, a lot longer. But people also have issues of trust, and it's very common, like in a lot of American, some European, some Southeast Asian universities, for students to take surveys. It's not very common in many Latin American countries, and particularly, as Tony mentioned, some of the regime issues. People are worried about, if I write something down, who's going to get the information? So we had to address a lot of those issues as well when it came to getting participants, which is why it's been slow going in Nicaragua, for example, and Colombia, which is why we also won't even try Venezuela, and we won't even try certain countries, just because we know we won't get any data, which is access to populations. Do we have access to them or not? And some of the firms that collect data don't have access to certain countries, but also we don't have contacts on the ground. So we're kind of stuck in that way with collecting the data. So it's a bigger issue. Like, we're working with colleagues in China, we're working with colleagues in Singapore, India, and I'll talk later at the end about we're always looking forward for more contacts. I've worked with contacts in Russia. I have a joint appointment with the Higher School of Economics at the National Research University. And my contact there, my good friend there, Tatiana, and we worked really on, working on how we can collect data while there's certain questions that probably shouldn't be asked in this context. So there's all these kinds of questions that need to be considered. So that's kind of the difficulties of the research. But what's been interesting about our Brazil project is basically just looking at Brazil first, because we wanted to look at, there's so many different countries we could look at, but we wanted to focus on Brazil because, as of this month, more than 19.1 million people have been infected with COVID in Brazil alone. I mean, if you think about that, New Zealand is a country of about 5 million. So it's almost 4 times the population of New Zealand has been infected with COVID in Brazil. And nearly 540,000 people have died from it. And that's just one country. But Brazil also had a rapid spike in COVID cases over the past few months. And what we see is there, the group that was often blamed for it wasn't Asians, but it was what's called the pretos, Pretos, which is Brazilian Portuguese for blacks. So in many cases, the dominant culture blames a minority. We found in India, for example, it was predominantly Hindus blaming Muslims. We found in Singapore, it was often Singaporeans blaming immigrants and blaming particularly Chinese and other Asian immigrants coming in, and even Indian workers, so immigrants. In Mexico, which we collected data in, it was Mexicans blaming the Americans, which I kind of appreciate. I kind of thought was funny because they brought it during spring break. They brought COVID during the spring break time. So there's always an out group. And we find with prejudice research, the dominant group always has to have some group that they compare themselves to. And in this case with COVID, in Brazil, we focused on the pretos. And we had a sample of a little over 400 people, which was really nice. Nowhere near representative, but statistically, it is representative. And we were looking at the extent to which COVID-19 related prejudice is related to the fear of the virus. So basically, how is prejudice related to fear of the virus? What results reveal is that ethnocentrism is positively related to prejudice. So basically, the more ethnocentric someone is, the more prejudiced they are, which supports previous literature. And also that fear of COVID. So the more you fear COVID, whether it's personal fear, public fear, that's positively related to prejudice. So basically, the more you think COVID's a threat to you, the more you're going to look at the pretos and say they are a threat to me. Because the rhetoric, there's so many reasons for this. The rhetoric, the media, so many different aspects are basically painting them as the scapegoat. And we see this throughout the world, scapegoats, the ones to blame. And the key factor we found was that fear of COVID really heightened those relationships. The more you're afraid of this contagion now that could kill you, the more you're prejudiced toward the minority group. So that's a bit about the Brazil project. I will say we're really proud. We actually just this week got the paper accepted in the WCA journal, the Journal of Intercultural Communication Research. So I was really proud of our group getting that paper in. And so it was really nice. It's been part of a larger project, but I was happy that the group who worked on that we got that in. So it was really nice to see. So Tao got another one. So next steps, and I'll turn these over to Tao in a second, but the next step is anyone who's watching later, or if we see Yen, we see you, or we see I think Anna, anyone else, if you'd like to collaborate, let me know. Send me an email, particularly when it comes to any regions that we don't have covered, or you could email me and say, hey, I'm from this country, I'd be interested in working with you. I can let you know if we're already working in that country and we need more, or just let you know we're always looking for collaborators. We have collaborators now in over 20 plus countries, and I've been really happy this larger group. We've got probably, I think, 10 or so publications either under review or published in the past like 2 months. So it's been really like hitting lots and lots and lots of stuff really fast. So it's really kind of exciting. The next step is really looking at different countries, and if we're talking about Latin America, is looking at different countries and really comparing them, not as much based on Hofstede or Hall. You'll find, if you know me, I don't really subscribe to Hofstede and Hall. I find that they're way too simplistic and actually theoretical. Is I would prefer to look at comparing based on issues of economics, politics, government systems, more going from a geopolitical or economic position when it's comparing on these levels, because I find that Hofstede it's just too simple. So, and no offense to anyone who might use Hofstede or Hall, they're just too simplistic for cultural comparisons. So we're using more at the geopolitical level, the higher level. And that's the next step, to compare these countries in South and Latin America. And so I'll turn things over to Tao now to look more at future research, and kind of what we see.
So now what we see now, so like personally, I think we should bring in more fields in this area. It's not just about the communication. So now we can collaborate with other researchers in different kinds of fields. It's like we really need to talk about the resilience after the COVID-19 pandemic, and how the pandemic has shaped our communication field and has brought us to new areas of doing research. I think it's kind of interesting, like when we talk about the pandemic, it's more like a factor to impact like every other angle in our field of doing research. So that's why I think in the next step in the future research, we need to do more with other researchers in other fields.
One of the other things I'll add to that is what's been interesting for us is we've found, especially in inter-group communication, what's been interesting, if you're looking to how groups interact with one another, particularly where this research in Prejudice comes from, is a big variable that we've identified, which we can't fully operationalize. So we can't fully measure it, and we can't fully conceptualize it, is we call the contagion effect. Basically, if you're looking to communication, you have the sender, receiver, and then you have noise around it, the very simple model in the message. What we're finding here is between these two groups, whatever the groups are, inside the psyche of both of the groups is basically the fear of the contagion. And we can go back to research on evolutionary biology and the idea of, fight or flight, and see whenever there's an issue of I have to fight or I have to escape, certain impulses come up and certain reactions come up. And we're finding that that's kind of what's happening here with COVID, is a lot of our models and theories, I would argue, my recommendation is if you're collecting data right now during the time of COVID, or if you have, there's going to be problems with some of the data, I bet, because of issues or the data will be a little bit off because we can't get rid of that fear of COVID, that contagion effect. So we'll increase our error in our data. And it's something we're still trying to grapple with and really try to model if we can. But that's one of the things we're finding in every country every country that we work in. So that's really it. We really wanted to have a conversation with folks. And as I said, a lot more people will be able to watch these later. and take what they can from these. But I'll open it up now for any questions. Feel free to type the question if you want in chat, or you raise your hand for a question. And if you don't have any, that's fine. We have 3 other panels that are going on that you can zoom into. So yeah. Mal.
So a bit of a comment. So I have an interest in Korea, and Prejudice showed up there. Initially, one of the sources of the outbreak was a church-based group. Now, it was convenient to target that church-based group because it fell outside of the conventional strong Christian community in Korea. But then the next source of the outbreak was supposedly a gay nightclub in Itaewon. And so suddenly there was if you like, a sense of a combined target that all the religious people of Korea could focus on. This is where COVID comes from. Then there was a mainstream, or a number of mainstream Christian churches that became centers of it. For me, it was interesting to watch the changes in prejudice expressed by the population between these 3 different groups. So I would say the mainstream church is a mainline group in Korea. You know, a third of the population, pretty much, it's decreasing, is represented by that. But interesting to watch, when it was a cult, it was okay. You could attack the church because it was a cult, marginalized group. When it was the gay nightclub, I mean, my question was, how come it was known to be straight people were infected with it and they went to this club? And that was almost like, don't ask that question. When I talked to my Korean friends in Korea about it, it was like, what do you mean? And then when it was the mainstream church, suddenly there was confusion as to where do we target our prejudice for the cause of this. There we go. That's just a commentary I've observed, and I have no research data to back it up.
There's a simple explanation, I think, actually, is what happens when we see this. We even see this in Brazil. We see this even in New Zealand. We see in all the countries. It's easier to scapegoat someone that has less characteristics than yourself, someone that's further from you, in whether it's political, religious, economic, social, whatever. And so in those cases, normally it's easier for people to buy media representations or buy other representations, but it's easier for the media also goes after those individuals more because they don't have to worry as much about, pushback from the public. So the easiest victims are generally the ones, or I would say the easiest scapegoats are generally the ones that are less like everyone else. And so as it becomes more and more like others, it creates confusion. It creates that noise, another kind of noise, which is really, they're more similar to me. So generally they can't be as bad because they're more similar. So, I mean, and we see that in New Zealand, where at first, one of the things is, Asians were blamed, Asian in general, not Chinese, but Asians, because it wasn't just Chinese who were being blamed for the spread of COVID, but Asians coming from like Indonesia and other places was what a lot of the media first started talking about, and some Kiwis started talking about. But then that shifted really quickly. Like in general, I would say there wasn't a whole lot. You can please correct me, Mal and Tao, but it wasn't a whole lot generally about Asians too much here in New Zealand. It then shifted to tourists and border workers. So basically the idea of as 2 islands, well, 3, as 2 big islands, we've locked ourselves off basically from the rest of the world. And so when tourists first came in, the fear is, or even not tourists, but returning Kiwis. We have managed isolation here in New Zealand, where basically when someone arrives in the country, well, first of all, to arrive here, you have to be a resident or a citizen. We don't allow any tourists in now. It's just no. But for the longest time, we've been letting Kiwis who've been living abroad come back. And many of them came back during COVID. They fled the US, they fled Asia, they fled Europe and came back. And they were angry they couldn't get back in time. And many of them who landed, we would hear each day on the news, 0 cases of COVID in the community, but 10 cases in managed isolation because they're being caught at the border and locked in hotels for 2 weeks. I mean, the country has had, I think, 25 deaths and I think 1,900 cases. Almost all of those cases are in managed isolation. I think in the community, we've had maybe like 10 cases in the community or something, because you basically lock everything off. And so the fear here is who could bring it in? Tourists. And we see from Australia, the last thing I'll say is we see from Australia with their managed isolations, the reason they failed was because people who worked at the MIQs, the managed isolations or the hotels, were fraternizing, in some cases having sexual relations with people in the managed isolation facilities, which brought COVID back to their families, and it spread in places like Sydney and Melbourne and other places. So you blame the people that are furthest from you. When it gets closer, you're less likely to do it. And we're seeing that throughout. It's playing out everywhere in different levels. Any other thoughts or?
So let me share something about Vietnam. So last year, we did pretty well with the response to the COVID-19, but now we are not doing really well right now. Like we have like 2,000 new cases every day. And now people are really scared and they start blaming people who have spread the virus. It's more like quite similar to the story in South Korea Mao just mentioned above. Like because of one of the Christian church, so it was a big cluster from the end of May, I believe, and now it's an outbreak in my country. So now people just blame that kind of group, just that group.
Yeah, and we see the cases everywhere. I mean, if we talk with Ilira in Kyrgyzstan, is the first group they really blamed was on television. They blamed China, they blamed China and Chinese. But then when the first cases hit Kyrgyzstan, they were from workers who were working, they were from Kyrgyz workers and Turkish workers living in Kyrgyzstan who traveled across the border into Russia or Kazakhstan or other neighboring states. And so they were basically people, they were Kyrgyz or Turkish who lived in Kyrgyzstan coming back home who brought it, became the next group. And so the prejudice evolves, it changes. And that's why all of these, even our research here on the Pretos, is a case study, because another group that was blamed at the very first by Bolsonaro, the president of Brazil, were meat packing workers, because that's where the first COVID cases were found, were in meat packing plants. So they blamed those workers first, but then he found they didn't get any traction. So then you could go to a spiral of silence or a media framing point of view and look at why did the narrative change? Because, think back to the Cold War. We need two groups against each other. Now it's the US, China, it was US, USSR. We always need an us and them. So yeah. Any other thoughts or questions? If not, that's okay, don't feel pressured. So you can always go into one of the other panels. So Mal.
Yeah, so just one other comment, a different form of prejudice I've come across in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I think I've heard of it in other countries. There are certain let me talk about Aotearoa, New Zealand. In talking with Māori people, they're very aware that they are more vulnerable than other population groups to the impact of COVID-19, and particularly in the medical area. And their history is, in previous influenza epidemics, Māori people had a much higher rate of death than other ethnic populations in New Zealand. And some people I've spoken to have said there doesn't seem to be any acknowledgement of this increased risk. So they perceive it as prejudice. In the efforts to address the impact of COVID-19, they see it as almost implicit prejudice that, hey, nobody's actually remembering that in all the previous pandemics going back to the late 19th century and onwards, we have lost more people than any other ethnic group, let alone talking about the economic and social impact, which is different. So there's another little twist to the whole idea when we look at the title, Communicating Prejudice. It's almost like we didn't communicate prejudice, we just didn't think about it for people like me of the dominant Pākehā. So that's been an interesting thing to come out of some of the interviews I've been doing. Anyway, that's just another perspective on prejudice and communication in the context of COVID-19. You'll read more about it once I actually get it written up and out into the press.
And finish your thesis. So,
That's the one.
So any last questions before we wrap up and I send you all to hopefully go visit one of the other panels, because there's 3 other panels going on. So going once, going twice, sold. So what I would encourage you to do though is please, first of all, if you are a member of WCA, wonderful. If you are not, please consider joining. The information you can find us on our website. But at the same time is please do go view some of the other panels and support the other participants. And we hope to see you at the closing ceremony as well. So all the best and thank you everyone, and be safe. Enjoy the rest of the conference. Bye.